It's a great pleasure today for me to introduce Tom Dietterich. I've known Tom for quite some time. Actually, I brought a prop. He actually was an author on my first machine learning textbook. And I got to meet him when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. And I guess this was not long after Tom started his first faculty position after getting his PhD at Stanford. And he came down to visit Berkeley, and I enjoyed getting to meet him then. And even then, as you see with this textbook, he was playing a very important role in shaping the machine learning community. And he's gone on since then to continue to play a very important role in shaping the machine learning community. So he is a AAAI fellow, an ACM fellow. He's been program chair for AAAI, program chair for NIPS. He's been very active in the International Machine Learning Society, and really a mentor in the field to a lot of young people. And Tom is one of the few people to this day who really sees the entire field of machine learning. And that's, as the field is becoming increasingly specialized, it's rare to find people who can really appreciate the whole field and take it all in. And that's one of many great things that Tom is known for. And today he's going to be telling us about a very important application of machine learning, which is to computational ecology and environmental management.
Thank you very much, Ron. So the work I'm going to be describing today is obviously very collaborative and interdisciplinary, and the collaborators in particular that I want to mention is my graduate student Ethan Derazinski, two postdocs, Rebecca Hutchinson and Dan Sheldon, and then colleagues Wenkeen Wong, who's in computer science, a machine learning person, Claire Montgomery, who's a forest ecologist, and then several folks at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So if we look at the Earth's ecosystems, or the biosphere, it's a very complex system, and I think we can agree that in many ways we have not managed it in a sustainable way. And so I thought I would start the talk by asking about why is that so, and is there anything that computer science can do to help? And I think, I mean, everybody has their own views of why this is so, but I think maybe there are three reasons. First of all, we don't understand the system very well, so it's very hard to manage a system when it's behaving very unpredictably. And there was a very thought-provoking article by a group of authors. First author was Doak in 2008, where they talk about, they ask the question, are ecological surprises inevitable? Or is the dynamics of ecosystems so complex that we will never really be able to predict the behavior of these systems reliably? And to sort of support this, thesis, they go through, 15 or 20 different examples of situations where either something completely surprising happened, like the population of a species in the Gulf of Alaska suddenly exploded and then 5 years later disappeared again, with no one knowing why. Or examples where we attempted an intervention in an ecosystem, and then it behaved in the outcome was very different from what we had intended. One example that is very current right now in the Pacific Northwest is the northern spotted owl. So during the late 80s and 1990s, we had what we call the owl wars in Oregon, because there's this species that was listed as an endangered species, the northern spotted owl, and its preferred habitat is old-growth forests, and these most of the old-growth forest on private land had already been cut, and so now there was a lot of logging in the national forests, in the public lands, and the conservation community wanted to shut down all of that logging, and obviously the forest products industry, which is a very important part of the Oregon economy, was dependent on it to a large extent. And it took, the president had to come to the state and bring everybody together, and they came up with something called the Northwest Forest Plan, which by and large did stop logging of old-growth forests on federal lands, which had a devastating impact on the economy. And the hope was that this would help the spotted owl recover, but spotted owl numbers have continued to decline since then. And partly that's because there was another species that has come in from the north, the Canadian invader, which is known as the barred owl. And it turns out it is more reproductively successful and more aggressive, and it seems to be pushing out the spotted owl. So that's another example of an ecological surprise, and it's one of the reasons why managing ecosystems is so difficult. I think another reason that we've had trouble managing ecosystems is that we've often focused on only a small part of a very large system, because the system is so complicated, and we focus on only one piece of it. So that could be a single species like the northern spotted owl might be an example of that. We've often also ignored some of the larger context. So there's a colleague of mine, Heidi Jo Albers, who has studied things like creating forest reserves in tropical forests. And often these forests, when you're designing these reserves, you need to also consider what the native people might be using that forest for. If you don't take that into account, in her case, that meant creating large buffer zones around the actual forest. You end up with those people making incursions into your bioreserve and degrading it in one way or another. So having to consider the spatial aspects, the interactions among multiple species, these are things that are often ignored in a lot of ecology and ecosystem management. And finally, I think particularly if you look in agriculture, we often deliberately manipulate a system to simplify it in order to try to manage it. So in crop agriculture, for example, we try to remove all the other species so that we only have to worry about one species. But as a consequence, we have to provide a lot of the support for that species that would normally be provided by other species, like fertilizers and pest management and so on. We have to provide those as exogenous inputs, and many of those, like say, some of the nutrients that we're providing now are becoming expensive, and this is not a sustainable way of managing those systems. Well, and I'm sure you could go on and list many other things. What can computer science have to offer? The reason I'm here is because I think there are several things. First of all, if we look at the question of our lack of the knowledge of the function and structure of the systems, we now have a couple of ways we can contribute. First of all, we and our colleagues in nanotechnology and electrical engineering, we're producing all kinds of novel sensors, right? That we have wireless sensor networks. We can create thousands of sensors, put them into these systems, and be able to monitor them much better. And of course, the machine learning community and computational statistics community have been working on building modeling techniques that can scale up to much larger systems. Although, of course, it's still a challenge, but much more than say, was possible 20 years ago. When it comes to this question about focusing on subsystems, some of the same story. Obviously, with our modeling tools, we can now look at the larger system in which the smaller system is embedded. But I think we also now have tools in, say, mechanism design to look at the interactions of different parties that might be competing for a resource, or tools in modern optimization that let us find good solutions to very large and complex optimization problems. And again, when we come to agriculture, it's a different combination of these three things, but better sensing, better modeling, and better optimization all have a role to play in allowing us to model these systems and manage them better. So this general field that we're calling computational sustainability is one of the big things that in my group is we are joint with Carla Gomes at Cornell, have one of the NSF expeditions in computer science projects. So a $10 million grant to try to boldly go where no computer scientist has gone before, and in particular to look at computational methods that can contribute to sustainable management of the Earth's ecosystems. And so as a machine learning person, I tend to think about the computational challenges that are here in terms of a pipeline from data to models to policies. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is first talk about what I see as some of the work that's going on in each of these areas outside of my group briefly, and then drill down on three specific things that we're doing in my group that contribute to this area. And so I'm hoping you'll get a sense of the range of challenge problems that are here and some of the opportunities from a computer science perspective. So the first thing I want to talk about is sensor placement. And Andreas Krause and his students have been doing some really exciting things there. So this particular example is a case where they are, whoops, I'm not supposed to point with this, I'll point with this, where this is a city's water network, and they want to know where should we place sensors in this network in order to detect a pollutant or maybe an attack, but a chemical that's introduced into the system. And their main tool that they use is something called submodularity, right? Which is the idea that if you have a function that's a function of a set, in this case the set of places that you have put your sensor, and that exhibits a diminishing returns property, that once you've placed k sensors, the k plus first one is going to give you less benefit than the kth one, and so on. Then you can formulate, if your objective function is submodular, then the greedy algorithm and various sophisticated variants of it give a performance that is within a constant of optimal, or a fraction of optimal. So you can get very good results, and in fact they won some competitions for water quality monitoring, and they've looked at many other problems as well. So sensor placement, and of course this has a lot of relationship to the huge literature in experiment design in statistics. The second thing that comes up is what I call data interpretation, for lack of a better word, which is that often the raw data you get from your sensors is not at the level that you want for your modeling effort. And this is particularly true for image data. So for the last 8 years, I've been running a project that we call the Bug ID project, where we take photos of moths and arthropods in soil and freshwater larvae, and we want to identify them to the genus level and ideally to the species level. And this might be, for instance, input to building a model of the distribution of species in space, to tracking invasive species, or even to water quality monitoring, where you want this histogram by species of how many individuals you had in a given stream. Come on, mouse, where are you? There. So this particular picture here is from a collaborator of mine, Qing Yao, who's looking at rice pests, and they put out these light traps at night, and moths wonderfully trap themselves in these traps, and then they spread them out on a glass table, photograph them from above and below, and then they want to identify to species level. The third problem then I call data integration. I guess that's an established term. And the problem is, with a lot of ecological modeling challenges, you have data coming from a wide variety of sources, and at a wide variety of scales in time and in space. And you need to somehow pull this all together in order to then fit a model to the data. And so in work we're doing, for instance, on bird migration modeling, we're dealing with data, everything from stuff that basically never changes, like a digital elevation model of the terrain, to things that are maybe changing on a 15-minute time scale, like the temperature or the weather, and having to integrate all of these things. And then we come to the part that is really my core competence, which is model fitting and machine learning. And so there are, of course, a wide range of models in ecology that people would like to fit. We've been looking really at just 3 kinds of models. The first are what are known as species distribution models. And the question there is, can we create a map of where a species is found in the landscape? And so that's very close to sort of a core machine learning, supervised learning problem. You're given a site with some set of features describing it, and then either the species is present there or absent there. Another kind of model is something called a metapopulation model, and here we imagine that we have a set of patches arranged in space, and a patch may be occupied by a species or not, and over time the species may reproduce, it may spread to other patches, it may go locally extinct and then get recolonized. So that's a sort of focusing on space and looking at what comes in and out of a cell. And then the other are sort of migration or dispersal models, where you follow the organism instead. So you want to model the trajectory, say, that a bird follows, or the timing of movement. And so there's work in machine learning on all of these. One I want to show is what's called a STEM model that was developed by Daniel Fink at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And so at the Lab of Ornithology, they have a big project called Project eBird, where if you're a birder, you can go out observing in the morning, say, and then fill out a checklist on their webpage and say, here's what I saw, and I didn't see anything else. You can click a button for that and then upload it. And there are a lot of avid birders out there. So we're now getting like 1 million data points a month from people uploading, and they exceeded 3 million points in May, sort of the peak of the breeding season. And so there's a lot of data. It's unfortunately it's completely uncontrolled, right? So you have lots of variation in expertise. You have no control over where people go, but you can still do some interesting things. And what Daniel does is fit ensembles of decision trees to try to predict whether this species, in this case the indigo bunting, will be present or absent at a particular place and time. And so I'm going to show you this movie, but it's important to realize this is a series of snapshots. There's no dynamical model here. But this species winters down in Central America, and you'll see the orange colors. This is the species is predicted to be present first along the Mississippi Valley and then sort of spread out through the entire eastern U.S. And then as we move into September, this is a sort of clock ticking along the bottom. You see the species goes back down the Mississippi and disappears from the U.S. And so this is a really, I think, a very nice model. And it was used as part of something called the State of the Birds report that tried to estimate what fraction of habitat for each of the something like 200 species of birds is publicly owned versus privately owned. And this report came out late last year. So now, once we have built a model like this, then it's time to say, well, it's great that we have this model of birds, but what can we use? How can we use that to make policy decisions to manage the ecosystem? And I don't have a good example for management with birds, but with fish, John Leithwick, who does excellent work in New Zealand. So I don't know if you can tell, but see these gray things over there? These are the islands of New Zealand. And these blue dots are where, and red dots correspond to places where fishing trawlers did not find or found. The red ones are positive, did harvest a particular species of fish, the Mora Moro. And the blue line around the outside is the exclusive economic zone of New Zealand. And so using this data, he fit a species distribution model similar to the one that I was just describing, except that instead of estimating presence or absence, he's estimating the catch in kilograms, so the biomass of the fish. And so these are his estimates. The blue areas, there are no fish at all, and then you can see this pattern. And then what he wanted to do is then use that to prioritize regions for their conservation value in terms of allowing this population to grow. And the left plot is prioritizing them if we ignore the fishing industry and just say, what would be the places that would best encourage the growth of the species? But of course, you really need to consider these within an economic context, and so the right diagram reprioritizes them now, taking into account the cost to the fishing industry. And you can see, I mean, the main lesson here, I think, is that there's still a lot of places that we can conserve and yet also still have the benefit of fishing. So, but this is a kind of spatial optimization problem to solve, and I'll be talking about some more of those. So finally, we have the problem of policy execution. This is usually, of course, the chasm to go from a design policy to one that we can convince people to actually adopt. You know, at the simplest level, we just have a policy where at each time step we observe the state of the system, and then we choose the action that our policy tells us to choose, and we go ahead and act. But in practice, we're often called upon to act in a lot of ecosystem management problems before we have a very good model of what's going on. And so they're really what we would call a partially observable Markov decision process, or worse, where we don't have a complete understanding of the system we're trying to model. And I think a challenge here is that this means that our policy in our early actions should be designed not only to achieve the ecosystem goal, but also to help us gather more information about the system so we can improve our model. So we have dual objectives, and these are very difficult to optimize. And one of the big concerns, I think, and particularly in light of these ecological surprises, is can we design policies that are robust to our lack of knowledge, both to the known unknowns, where we know that we're uncertain and we can model our uncertainty, and then also to the unknown unknowns, the factors that we forgot to include in the model. And I think that's one of the most interesting intellectual questions. I don't have an answer for it, but I think that there are some things we might be able to do. Okay, so that's the review of this sort of pipeline. And now I'd like to talk about 3 specific projects at Oregon State. And these will be in data interpretation, in model fitting, and in policy optimization. So the first project is the dissertation project of my student Ethan Derajinsky, and he's going to be graduating soon, so he's looking for a job. And what he works on is automated data cleaning in sensor networks. So Oregon State University operates something called the H.J. Andrews Long-Term Ecological Site. So NSF funds a collection of these study sites where they're committed to collecting data over long periods of time and doing long-term experiments. So one of my colleagues, Mark Harmon, for instance, has started an experiment that's going to last 200 years. That's called the ROT experiment. It's about trees and how long it takes them to decay. It takes forever to get tenure in this field. Anyway, in this case, we're looking at these weather stations that are there, and I'm going to talk mostly about 4 thermometers. So this is a weather tower here, and these little L-shaped things coming off have a thermometer on them, and they're allegedly at 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, and 4.5 meters above the ground. And we get data from them that looks something like this. So every 15 minutes, we get a temperature reading, and you can see on these curves the up and down motion. Those are the daily cycle, the diurnal cycle. So it's warming up in the daytime and cooling off at night. And it's kind of fun because the thermometer that's nearest the ground, which is the black line is the one that is coldest at night and hottest in the day. So they flip back and forth like this. And the problem is that these sensors are out in the world, and bad things happen to them. So someone has to do data quality assurance on these on the sensor data and clean it up before we try to do any analysis on it. Now, traditionally, in the Andrews Forest, we've got 3 of these towers, and then there are many more, but there are 3 main ones that have been in operation since the 80s. And with 12 thermometers, it's not really much of a burden for someone to go check this data. They just eyeball it and cluster it in various ways and look for outliers. But of course, now we've got Wi-Fi over the entire forest, and we want to put out huge networks of things. And if we have 1,000 thermometers, this human data cleaning becomes infeasible, unless we can figure out how to make a CAPTCHA out of it and maybe get people to do it. So the kinds of things that go wrong, like for instance here, this is an instance of what's called a broken sun shield. And so the air temperature sensor is now measuring actually the surface skin temperature of the thermometer with the sun directly beating down on it. And so you can see in the daytime it spikes way high, as many as 10 degrees higher than the true air temperature. At night it's a perfectly good air temperature sensor, but in the daytime, particularly sunny days, not so good. Can anyone guess what's going on in the bottom case here? We have this, our 1.5 meter sensor is flatlining for a while. Yes, so the problem here is this is week 3, so that means it's right about now. But it was in 1996. We had a big snowstorm. And so this is now a snow temperature sensor instead of an air temperature sensor. In some sense, the thermometer is still functioning correctly. It's just that the metadata is wrong. But there's a lot more going on here. So you notice that the 4.5 meter thermometer is still bouncing up and down rather nicely. I mean, it's obviously over here, it's quite cold these days. Even the nights, or even in the daytime, it's just barely getting above freezing. But then, what's happening over here? We're getting, it's really warmed up. I mean, it's almost it's in the 50s at the top of the thermometer tower. And that does, right around 3,500 here, it's starting to rain. And so the snow temperature moves up to the sort of triple point of water for a while. And now the snow is melting, and and the university is closed right around 4500 because we had such a huge flood that you couldn't get to campus. So this is how you get a big flood in Oregon, is to have what's called a rain on snow event, and this was one of them. So we like to detect these things also, because they're interesting, but we don't want to assume that this thermometer was measuring air temperature during this entire period. So how can we do this? Well, we'd like a data cleaning system to do really two functions. The first is we'd like it to mark every data value that we think is anomalous. And so in this case, this is a different set of data, but we've put a little red, what they call the rug, right, a little red tick underneath each data point that our model predicts is incorrect, is something wrong. And then the other thing you'd like it to do is to impute or predict, fill in the missing values, what the thermometer should have been reading if it had been working correctly. And we're going to do this. We're going to do both of these things using probabilistic modeling. So the basic probabilistic model we're going to use, though these are Bayesian networks or probabilistic graphical models, is the following. We're going to have one node here for each of our variables of interest, and the one that is gray, that's an observed node. So this is the observed temperature at time t. And then there's a hidden node, which is our true temperature that we wish we could observe directly. And then up here is our sensor state variable, and I've made it a box to indicate that it's a discrete, whereas these are continuous variables. And the idea is a very simple sensor model that says when the sensor state is 1, that is normal or working, then the observed temperature has a Gaussian distribution whose mean is the true temperature x, but with some small variance around that. But when the thermometer is broken, and so the state is 0, then the observed temperature has a mean of 0 and a gigantic variance. So basically we're saying it is completely unrelated to the true temperature. So this is a very simple model, and why do we adopt this kind of model? Well, you could try to think about this kind of data as if it were a diagnosis problem, that the sensor has various fault modes or failure modes, and you want to predict what they are. And so you could do a kind of Bayesian diagnosis, right? You could say, well, given the sensor readings and my expectations, it looks like it's a broken sunshield, or it looks like it's a flat line because of a communications failure or something like this. But the trouble is we were not confident that we could enumerate in advance all the ways a sensor could fail. We wanted to have an open-ended set. So the idea here is to treat it more as an anomaly detection problem, where we model the normal behavior of the sensor as accurately as we can, and then anything that is a serious departure from normal, this model, the normal model will, the first line will give it very low likelihood, and it'll instead get picked up by this sort of generic failure model. So that's the idea here. So we can do anomaly detection then by doing probabilistic inference. We ask the query, what is the most likely value of the state of this sensor at time t? And that's just the argmax over the possible states of the probability of the state given the observation. And we can also do imputation by asking instead, what's the most likely temperature given the observed temperature? So basic probabilistic inference techniques work just fine. Of course, this is a very bad model of the sensor here. So the next thing we want to do is add some sort of Markov model so that we can look at the history of the sensor, because we'd like to say, well, sensors, if it was working 15 minutes ago, it's probably still working now. And if it was broken 15 minutes ago, it's very likely it's still broken now. So we'd like to do that. And similarly, of course, the actual real temperature doesn't change that drastically either. So we'd like to have some model of how the true temperature changes over time. So this gives us now a Markov version of this. And now we can ask a query like, what's the most likely state of this sensor at this time, given the entire observation history? And that also can be reasonably calculated. But we can go even further than this. If we have multiple sensors, as we do on these towers, we could build a separate copy of the model for each of them and then couple those somehow. So we could say that, if we know the temperature of the sensor at the bottom of the tower, then we should be able to predict with reasonable accuracy the sensor next up on the tower. And so this is the kind of thing we do. In general, we learn a sparse joint Gaussian distribution among all of the the t variables, and then and so that we have a connected model. Unfortunately, probabilistic inference in these models starts to become intractable. So even in the single sensor model, which with the Markovian dependence, you would think that that would not be a problem. But it is, because our observed variable, that would be true if all the variables were discrete, then we could solve that very easily. As a simple message passing algorithm will do it. But because our variables are continuous, so they're conditional Gaussians, when you marginalize away the history, it gives you a mixture of Gaussians that grows exponentially with the number of time steps. And so it becomes impractical to do more than just a few time steps before that won't work. So what we do is basically a forward filtering process where we, at each time step, we ask, what's the most likely state of my sensor? And then we say, okay, we'll believe it, and we'll adopt that state and treat it as evidence. And then at time 2, we'll ask, okay, what's the most likely state at time 2, given that I already committed to the state at time 1? And we do this. And so now, and we also have to bound the variance on the true temperature, just because if you have a long string of sequences where the sensor is bad, the true temperature becomes extremely uncertain, and you can't let that grow too far. Probabilistic inference is also infeasible in the multiple sensor model, even if you follow this step-by-step commitment strategy. And so the solution we're using right now, which seems to work best for us, is something we're calling search map, which at each time step you start by assuming that all the sensors are working, and you score how well that accounts for the observations. And then you ask, can I improve that score by breaking one of the sensors? And you do this in a greedy algorithm, basically hill climbing, to try to find a map solution. You don't always find the true maximum because there are local optima. But even the simple greedy algorithm takes polynomial time that's quite substantial in the number of sensors. Yeah.
Working even if in the previous time's commitment you decided one of them was broken?
That's what we're doing right now, but we could start with our map guess from the previous time step too. And you can also consider a variation where having broken one sensor, you might reconsider your previous decision, in which case you can do, I don't know, sometimes called floating greedy algorithm, which takes even longer but gives you better solutions. And we've tried a whole bunch of other things, various kinds of expectation propagation and the whole bag of tricks in the machine learning probabilistic modeling area. But actually, one thing we haven't tried yet is particle filters. He's working on that right now. Raoul Blackwell has particle filters. So, well, here are our single sensor results. So on the broken sun shield, you can see that the bottom curve is the data again. The bottom plot is the data. The top plot is the predicted temperature of just the thermometer, the one that's closest to the ground. And then along our predicted curve, we color code it with our domain experts wanted us to not just have broken or working, but to actually have 4 levels of performance, from very good, good, bad, and very bad. So very bad would be black, and there's just a couple of spots at the very peaks of these days when there are some black spots there. But otherwise, it's mostly marked things as red for bad, and at night, of course, it's a very good sensor. So we're able to do using just the single sensor model, and there's a lot more in the single sensor model. We build a baseline expectation based on previous years, so that we sort of know what week 6 looks like in general. And then for the multi-sensor case, Ethan did an internship at EPFL in Switzerland, and there they put out these short-term deployments of sensor networks, and he learns a conditional, well, in this case, conditional Gaussian Bayesian network over the true temperatures, and then fits that combined model, and so these are the results, and you can see that it's doing quite well in some cases. It's picking out a lot of these things where we have like extremely bad spiky sensors, but in these long flat lines, it's doing okay, except sometimes when the dashed line here is the imputed value, when the predicted value happens to coincide with the flat line, it says, oh, the sensor's working again. This is a case where we probably really should have a flat line model, because these flat lines happen when the data link is lost. Okay, and there are many other challenges. I mean, we're working at a single time step, but of course, it really should be multiple scales, and we're also working on integrating more heterogeneous sensors than just temperature. Okay, well, so that's an example of this automated data cleaning work. The next problem is model fitting with an explicit detection model. And this is work by a postdoc of mine, Rebecca Hutchinson, who's wrapping up her postdoc later this spring. I already talked about species distribution modeling. Often, particularly with birds and wildlife in general, when you go out and do a wildlife survey, you have the problem that the species could be there, but you just fail to detect it. And this is a well-known problem in ecology. So imagine that there's some landscape, and we've chosen some set of these black squares that we're going to go survey. But when we go out there, it turns out some of the birds are in the vegetation, and we don't see them. So although there were every one of those squares was occupied by our species, we only see it twice. What can we do about that? Well, one solution is to make repeated visits that are close enough together in time that you think the birds have not moved around, like when they're sitting on their nests or something, but far enough in time that you think you're getting independent measurements of their hiding behavior. So if we go back another day, maybe now we see the bird from the first cell, but the bird in the second cell is hiding. The third one we still think is unoccupied because that bird was hiding the whole time, and so on. So this is one strategy that you can use. And if you look at the kind of data you get what are called detection histories. So suppose we have 4 different sites. 3 of them are in forests and 1 is in a grassland. And suppose that there's this true occupancy, which we say is a latent or hidden variable, right? And the first 3 sites are occupied and the 4th one is unoccupied. But we don't know that. That's hidden from us. So on the first day, we go out, and it turns out it's a rainy day, and we're going out at lunchtime, and we don't see any birds. So we have all zeros here. Now another day, we go out early in the morning. It's a very good time to go birding, and it's a clear day, and we detect the birds in the first 2 sites, but we don't detect this guy here in site 3, and of course we don't detect anything at site 4, because we're going to assume no false detections here, no hallucinations. Although that's not always a safe assumption. And then the third day, it's a clear day, but we're a little late getting out, so we only detect the bird in the first site. So this thing like 011 or 010 is called a detection history. And from the detection histories, you can estimate, if you assume they're independent trials of your detecting ability, you can get a naive estimate of your detection probability. So in this case, we know from our data that sites A and B are occupied by the species. And we know we had 6 opportunities to detect the birds, 3 at each site. We succeeded 3 times, so our naive estimate of our detection probability would be 0.5. But in fact, we really had 9 chances to observe the species, of which we only saw it 3 times. So our true detection probability, at least a maximum likelihood estimate thereof, would be 0.3 or 1/3. So the big challenge is how can we tell the difference between an all zeros history that is due to our failure to detect versus an all zeros history that's due to the fact that the site is unoccupied. And the answer, of course, is to build a probabilistic model. And so this is a plate-style model. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the notation, think of these dashed boxes as being for loops. So we have a loop where we iterate over the site. So I indexes a site, and x sub I is some set of features that describes the site, like it's a forest and it's at 300 meters of elevation. And at each site then, based on its features or its properties, there's going to be some occupancy probability, O sub I. And we're going to assume that birds toss a coin with probability of heads O sub I to decide whether to occupy a site, and Z sub I is the true occupancy status of that site, either 0 or 1. And now the variable T is going to index over our visits to that site when we go observing. So WIT is some description of, say, it was 6 a.m. and it was sunny that might influence or account for our detection probability. And so then YIT is the actual report, the data that we get. So we actually observe X, W, and Y, but we really want Z. So we'd like to extract out of this ZI, which is the species distribution model, the probability of a site being occupied given the properties of that site. And we'll call a function, I'm going to name the probability of Z, that function F. So F of Xi is going to be the occupancy probability, and we'd love to plot that on a map. But then we have this nuisance model, which is our observation model, and we'll let DIT be the value of this function G that is our detection probability. And so we can say that our probability of reporting a 1 that we saw the bird is the product of Z, which will be 1 if the bird is there, and DIT, which is the probability we'll detect it. So that's the model, and this was developed by a group, McKenzie et al. From the USGS, but it's a very nice and well-established model. But I'm a machine learning person, and in machine learning there's sort of two parallel communities. There's the community that loves probabilistic models, and there's the community that loves non-parametric kind of decision models like support vector machines and decision trees. And these two communities, well, there are people like me that have one foot in both camps, but they really have very different outlooks. Why do we like probabilistic graphical models? Well, it's a terrific language for expressing our models, and we have wonderful machinery using probabilistic inference for reasoning about them. So we know what the semantics of the models are, or at least what they're intended to be. And we can also write down models that have hidden variables, latent variables that describe some hidden process that we're trying to make inferences about. So probabilistic graphical models are kind of like the declarative representation of machine learning. But there are some disadvantages, particularly when you're exploring in a new domain and you don't understand the system well. Because you, as the designer, have to choose the parametric form of each of the probability distributions in the model. And you need to decide if you think there are interactions among variables, you need to include those interactions in the model. The data typically have to be pre-treated to be scaled and so on. If you've assumed linearity in your model, then you may need to transform your data so that the model, it will have a linear relationship. And one of the most important things we've learned in machine learning is the importance of adapting the complexity of your model to the complexity of the data. And it's difficult to adapt the complexity of a parametric model. I mean, there are some things you can do with regularization, but it's not as flexible as using the sort of flexible machine learning models. So, back at that very first machine learning workshop, from which that book came out, Ross Quinlan gave a talk about a classification tree method that he was developing, and it was about a couple years later that Leo Breiman and company published the book on CART. So classification and regression trees are a very powerful kind of exploratory non-parametric method, and one of the beauties is that you can just use them off the shelf, right? You don't have to design your model, you don't have to pre-process or transform your data. They automatically discover interactions if they're there, and sometimes even if they're not there. And they can achieve higher accuracy if you use them in ensembles, so boosting and bagging and random forest type techniques. And then, of course, since then, the support vector machine kind of revolution has swept through machine learning, and these still require the same data preprocessing and transformation steps, but by using kernels, you can introduce the nonlinearities in an extremely flexible way, and they have very powerful ways of tuning the model complexity to match the complexity of the problem. So they work remarkably well also without a lot of careful design work. So challenge is, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we write down probabilistic graphical models with latent variables in them that describe processes we care about, and yet also have the benefits of these non-parametric methods? And this is a major open problem in machine learning, and there are several efforts. There's been a lot of work recently in the SVM family. There's Bayesian non-parametrics that use mixture models. The approach we're exploring is boosted regression trees. So I don't really have a lot of time to describe boosted regression trees, but they grew out of the boosting work in machine learning. And then first Mason and then Friedman, Jerry Friedman in Stanford, noticed that these could really be viewed as part of a generic algorithm schema where you're going to fit a weighted sum of regression trees to data. And so he developed this thing called boosted tree regression, or tree boosting. And so the standard approach in these occupancy models is to represent these functions f and g as log linear models, or linear logistic regressions. What we're going to do is replace those functions f and g with non-parametric flexible models, boosted regression trees. And this can be done using this algorithm schema called functional gradient descent, or you could do functional EM actually also. We had a paper at AAAI last summer that describes the method. So I'll just give you a little flavor for the results. Of course, there are methodological problems with studying latent variable models, and that is that you don't know the true values of those variables. They're hidden from you. So how do you know whether you're doing well? So I'm going to describe results for one synthetic bird species where we simulate a species using real data, but faked occupancy and fake things. So we made this model additive but nonlinear. And this is a scatter plot showing on the horizontal axis the true occupancy probabilities for this simulated species, and on the vertical axis what different families of models predict. So the left column is models that are trained without latent variables, treating it as a supervised learning problem. And you can see that they systematically underestimate the true occupancy probabilities because they assumed that the only positive examples they saw were the cases when you actually detected the bird, which is obviously an underestimate of what's really going on. On the right, and the right-hand column are ones that are using this latent variable model, the occupancy detection model, the OD model. And then the top row are where we're using logistic regression as our parameterization. And you can see that on the top right, it's more or less unbiased. So the true probabilities and the predicted ones more or less lie in that diagonal line, which is where they should be. But there's a lot of scatter, and that's because the true model is nonlinear, and we're fitting a linear model. Whereas if we use the boosted regression trees in the bottom, we're doing a lot better. We're much closer to the line. I'd like to omit a couple of the points that are far from the line, but otherwise we're pretty happy with that fit. And so in general, this is what we find is that we can train these flexible boosted regression tree models within a graphical models framework and get more accurate results. And so we've been applying this to several bird species data. So looks like I'm running tight on time here, so let me briefly just describe the final problem, which is managing fire in Eastern Oregon. Conveniently, this is the problem where we don't have any results yet, so I shouldn't have said anything you wouldn't notice. So this is now a policy problem, not really a data problem. Since the late 1910s, 1920, the U.S. Forest Service had a policy of suppressing all fires, essentially. It was part of the kind of political argument that was used to sell the creation of the Forest Service was that we will prevent these terrible catastrophic wildfires. Of course, it turns out you can't prevent them, you can only postpone them. And that's now coming to pass, that our forests are filled with, we believe that the sort of natural state of forests, particularly in Eastern Oregon, should look something like this, where we have very large ponderosa pines, and then what's called an open understory. So just very small vegetation on the ground. I don't have a picture for it, but what we have right now is, because fire has been suppressed for a long time, we have all kinds of vegetation on the forest floor, and we have small trees of all different sizes, lodgepole pine in particular, that's grown up among these ponderosa pine. And so when you have an open ground like that and a fire happens, it burns through the ground and actually maintains that openness. But the ponderosa pines have this big, thick, fire-resistant bark, and they're actually happy with this fire coming through and getting rid of some of their competitors. But what's happened is, since that hasn't happened, now when a fire happens, it is able to climb up the smaller vegetation, reach the crown, and actually destroy the forest, kill all the trees. And you end up with these really very intense catastrophic fires. And so one question is, is there anything we can do to manage this landscape? And so we have a study area in Eastern Oregon that's divided up into about 4,000 cells. They're of irregular shape. They're based on homogeneity of the landscape there. There are 4 things you can do to each of these cells each year. You can do nothing. You can do what's called mechanical fuel treatment. So you send people in and they cut down a lot of that small vegetation and cart it out. You can do clear cutting, where you harvest the trees, but you leave behind a lot of debris, and that actually, while it gives you timber value, it actually increases fire risk. Or you can do clear cutting and fuel treatment, and then fire just can't burn at all in that area, at least for a few years. So the question is, how should we position these treatments in the landscape if we want to, say, minimize the risk of big catastrophic fires and maybe maximize the probability of these low-intensity ground fires? Well, we can think about this as kind of a game against nature. In each time step, we can observe the current state of the landscape. Maybe this is like a fire risk map. And then we choose an action. We have to choose an action, which is actually a vector of actions, one action in each cell. And then nature takes, so these are the actions maybe we choose to treat these particular cells. And then nature has its turn and it lights fires and burns them. And then it's our turn again. And so we can model this as a big Markov decision process. But unfortunately, it's a Markov decision process with an exponentially large state space. So if each of these cells in my landscape has 5 tree ages and 5 fuel levels, then I have 25 to the 4,000th power possible states of the landscape, which is not going to fit into memory very easily. And similarly, each time I take an action, I have an action vector that has got 4,000 elements, and each with 4 possibilities in each position. So I have 4 to the 4,000th possible actions to consider. And even with all of the cleverness of the reinforcement learning community and approximate dynamic programming, we don't know how to solve these problems. There's been a little bit of work. There was a paper by Wei et al. A couple of years ago when they looked at just a 1-year planning problem. So if I just had 1 year to make treatments, and then there's going to be fires for 100 years, where should I put my treatments? And they were able to formulate and solve a mixed integer program for this optimal one-shot solution. They were just completely trying to prevent fire, which is really not the right problem. But in any case, we're trying now to see whether we can build on that work or come up with some method where we can solve this MDP over a 100-year horizon. Okay, so in summary, I've talked about this pipeline for ways that computation could help in addressing problems in ecology and ecosystem management. I've talked about automated data cleaning, about fitting these flexible models within a latent variable modeling framework, and then very briefly about policy optimization. And as I mentioned, this is part of our larger effort in what we call computational sustainability. There are many other opportunities to contribute to this. I haven't talked about energy, I haven't talked about sustainable development or smart cities or any of these things, but there are lots of computational problems there as well. I'd like to point out that the Computing Community Consortium, I think the CCC, is funding some travel grants and prizes for papers in this area at several AI conferences. I know about the ICML and AAAI, but I think there may be some other conferences where they're doing this year. So there's a special track for that that you could submit to. And my joint grant with Cornell, we've created something called the Institute for Computational Sustainability, and we have a website with all kinds of information about what's going on, not just in our own research, but throughout the computer science community. And I'll just thank the people that I mentioned at the start of the project. On the fire project, there are 2 other graduate students, Rachel Hauptman and Sean McGregor, who've been working there. And of course, the National Science Foundation has been very generous here. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll answer questions. So how does this work, local versus remote?
So what we usually do is give the remote sites a chance to go first because they might lose the connection later on.
Okay. Remote sites?
This is from NC State. So I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about the one-shot method. Could you go over that a little bit?
Okay, yeah. So what they do is they run several thousand simulated fires, and try to calculate for each cell in their landscape the probability that it will burn. And they decompose that into the probability that it will burn because the fire ignited in that cell, or the probability that it will burn because fire propagated from one of its neighbors. So they can basically build a sort of probabilistic flow model that says the probability that this cell will burn conditioned on whether its neighbors burned. And then they can model a fuel treatment, which they model simply as, if I treat this cell, then no fire will be able to propagate through that cell. Okay, and so with a couple of other approximations, they can turn this into a flow problem, basically, that we want to prevent flow from the total flow. We want to minimize, subject to some budget constraint about how many cells we can afford to treat. And so that they basically, then they have one integer variable for each cell, and they have an objective, and they can solve it. It's, I mean, in our case, there'd be 4,000 integer variables, which would be a little scary. Their problem was, I think, we had more like 900 cells, though, so it was still quite substantial. But, you know, Cplex is a wonderful thing, and so it was able to find the solution to that.
Thanks. And I had a comment about the use of the term one-shot.
Okay.
Because I tend to confuse it with the one-shot in
Right. Well, this was one shot as opposed to sequential decision making. So here we just get one. We just get one time step at which we're allowed to take actions, and then from there on out, nature just gets all the moves in the game. So that's the sense in which it's a single decision, single one-shot plan, totally upfront planning, in other words. And there are a lot of problems in ecology where we end up having to take that view that we're just going to say we want to buy all of the following territory. So we've looked at some there's an endangered species called the red cockaded woodpecker that I believe is here in North Carolina, and my postdoc Dan Sheldon did some very nice work where the question was there are two pockets of this species, one I think at Camp Lejeune and the other in the Palmetto Palm Preserve or something like this, and the question was, could they buy a series of intermediate sites to encourage those two species to mix and have some genetic flow between them. So it's a problem of basically trying to encourage flow instead of trying to prevent flow. And they were able to also formulate this and solve it for the one-shot case in terms of building a network that would maximize flow subject to budget constraints. But the real problem, you can't buy all the property all at once. You don't have the money, and it isn't all available. So you really need to be online, and every year take some actions that you can afford to take to keep moving toward that objective. So turning that into a Markov decision problem, or what's often called active management in the environmental literature, that's still an open problem. We don't know how to do that.
One more question from State, please. This may be naive because I don't understand the subject well. Is there a role for principal component analysis anywhere in this to reduce the state space exposure that you have?
That is a good question. And we do wonder, is there some way we could come up with some set of sort of spatial basis functions that would let us, for instance, represent, suppose that we had an optimal policy for laying out treatments in the landscape, could we, but we can only compute it for a particular fixed landscape. Could we somehow generalize from that to a more general policy, and maybe some kind of set of spatial basis functions would allow us to do that? And the same is true for looking at the sort of structure of the landscape. There's certainly a lot of work done in atmospheric sciences and weather, where they basically use PCA to create a set of basis functions that they can use then to approximate a lot of things. So it's something we'd like to explore more.
Your data
I'm sorry?
your data is very dynamic, I think, compared to the other people, other applications.
Right. Well, in particular here, we're intervening in the system, and so yeah, the trouble is that you have this a search space where if I take these actions, then these fires will burn. If I take these actions, something else will happen, and you end up having to do exponentially many simulations just to simulate one sort of search tree, and so obviously we have to rely on some kind of sampling or some kind of way of capturing the spatial scale where beyond which we can ignore the spatial components. It's not clear really how to proceed.
If I could just follow up while we're on this topic. Due to the size of your problem and the irregular nature of the cells that you're looking at, to what degree do you get transfer in the knowledge that you learned from inspecting the models? Is it the case that forest management in Oregon is going to tell us something about forest management in eastern North Carolina?
Well, that is a very good question. Right now, we've mostly been looking at just this one site, and we have the weather data and all the data about the site, which we need to be able to do the work. And it's a good question whether there are generalizable lessons that we could take away from this. I also have some projects in invasive species management, and we're asking the same question there. And often it's kind of disturbing. I mean, you get a solution like this big map here, wherever it was, that says, well, these are the places that are the optimal places for me to treat. But is there any pattern to that? Is there any way we could explain that as a sort of set of rules that we could apply to a different situation? How can we generalize from this particular landscape? And we need to do that just to explain it to our domain experts. Obviously, policymakers are not going to be happy just being told, well, it's optimal. Our algorithm said so, particularly because we won't be able to say that. We'll have to say, it's approximately optimal, but we don't know how bad, or something like that. And so we're really going to need to be able to give them some qualitative understanding and let them be able to play with it and modify it and explore and understand how good it is. And that's a huge challenge too. Just explain, once you've done 10 million simulations, what lesson can you take away from it?
Okay. So I've got a question that maybe dovetails with that. So, to what extent do you feel like these techniques and the recommendations or policies that you're producing using these techniques are getting traction with the people who are actually implementing policy decisions? And is it something where you feel like you're having impact now? You feel like maybe it'll be 5 years, 10 years? What time scale are we talking about here?
I would guess in 5 to 10 years. I mean, we're very fortunate with the forest situation that we have some of the Forest Service people on our team. And a lot of them are former students of Claire Montgomery, who's on the team. And so we have a nice working relationship with them. But the question is, it is a good question whether they would ever be able to execute our particular policies. I think one of the main things we're trying to do is give them backup ammunition for being able to support the actions that they are taking. Right now, the idea that they might want to treat the landscape in a particular way, or a related problem, they might want to let a fire burn instead of suppressing it. That's an extremely controversial, politically difficult decision. And if we could provide some analysis that shows that, yes, under a wide variety of scenarios, it would be better to let this fire burn, or it's better to treat this than these other things, then that might help them persuade their stakeholders to go along with it. Of course, another thing that would help them persuade their stakeholders is if we could say, well, and for these small communities that have timber mills, we can also guarantee you a certain economic benefit from doing this. And so there's a whole set of economic objectives perhaps that we'd like to have. We'd maybe also like to have a whole bunch of endangered species habitat objectives. So the real problem, gets messier and messier. But we won't be able to attack any of those unless we really can come up with a methodology that works for these problems.
What you just laid out is a hard scenario for any algorithm or any procedure to optimize. But as it is, it has to be optimized by humans. I mean, in other words, there are people actually making decisions about whether or not to let a fire burn, and they have to process all this. So,
Right.
I mean,
Well, mostly they are not letting fires burn because it's just too risky, and plus the firefighting money doesn't come out of their budget; it's somebody else's budget. So there's not really any incentive for them. For the fuel treatment, though, you're right. Right now, they're making some guesses about where to treat, trying to balance all of these issues, and I would say they're not very happy with that. They would like some more rational basis for making those decisions.
Yeah, I guess my point was you may not have to get optimal, you may just have to do better than humans guessing.
Right, well, but we have to convince them that we are doing better, yeah. And that comes into a lot of this broader contextual thing as well. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, could you sort of apply the Bayesian approach? Could you just take the particular plans or policies that they are using or thinking of using as a prior, and then go from there and simplify your model because you're working from a targeted assumption base.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, it would be to see if we could, in some sense, model what they're doing, and then ask locally how could we improve it, without walking too far away from it, so that it doesn't look so strange or threatening. Yeah. No, we hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting idea. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.